Good afternoon, dear viewers. You are on the Ruslan Belov channel, and in today's episode, we will examine the situation in the conflict zone in Ukraine as of November 24, 2025. Many significant events have been recorded over the past day, so I propose we proceed immediately to their analysis. So let's move on to reviewing the line of combat contact. Numerous important news items are coming from the front, so let's begin their detailed examination. First, we'll examine the Zaporizhia sector, where two military groupings, Dnieper and East, continue to develop the Zaporizhia offensive. Regarding the sector of responsibility of the Dnieper grouping, today a multitude of diverse data has been received from the Stepnogorsk direction. Yesterday's map, dated November 23rd, looked as follows. Today, information is coming in that Russian forces managed to practically encircle the Stepnogorsk citadel microdistrict. This refers to a compact area in the northern zone with high-rise buildings. Russian forces bypassed this microdistrict simultaneously from the western and eastern directions, which is confirmed by various cartographic sources, effectively closing the ring. It is not ruled out that in the near future, Ukrainian forces will be forced to leave these positions. At the same time, information is coming in about the Ukrainian army beginning a counterattack from the northern districts of Primorsk, with the intention of reaching the central part of Primorsk, possibly even its southern outskirts. It is likely that at this moment, all these counter-attacking actions have a single objective: to unblock the AFU garrison holding the Stepnogorsk citadel. Let's see how events will develop further. Next, we move to the settlement of Orikhiv. I remind you that several days ago, pro-Ukrainian sources disseminated data that Russian forces undertook another attempt at a mechanized assault in the direction of Orikhiv from the side of Novodanilovka. Ukrainian sources then reported that only one IFV with a landing force participated in the attack, which reached this point near Novodanilovka. The landing force managed to disembark and secure themselves in these structures. However, the Ukrainian side claimed several days earlier that when Russian equipment was returning from Novodanilovka in the direction of Robotyne, the equipment was hit by drones and destroyed. But today, November 24, 2025, video footage of this assault appeared. And judging by this brief report published by the 65th Brigade of the AFU operating in this direction, at least 2 tanks, several IFVs, motorcycles, and a significant amount of personnel were involved in the attack. Thus, we observe certain discrepancies with previous reports. The presented footage shows Russian forces' equipment that approached as close as possible to Novodanilovka. The landing force successfully disembarked. The equipment apparently was abandoned, since they clearly understood that it wouldn't return. We observe foggy weather, which allowed the Russian side to take advantage of favorable weather conditions for conducting the assault and receiving maximum protection from drones. Based on these frames, most cartographic resources made certain corrections. Some designated the territory between Robotyne and Novodanilovka as a grey zone pending additional data. Others, like us, coloured it, displaying the consolidation of Russian forces in the southern sector. In any case, active fighting is currently ongoing here. If we summarize all events on the Orikhiv direction over the past 2 months, it should be recalled that the Russian army during October and early November managed to completely clear the settlement of Malotokmachka. Russian units, according to information from the Ministry of Defense and various sources close to the situation, managed to approach directly to Orikhiv. Currently, attempts by Russian forces to reach Orikhiv also from the southern side are being observed. That is, apparently, a large-scale offensive in the direction of Orikhiv is beginning, the goal of which is probably to divert significant reserves to prevent the transfer of these reinforcements further east, toward Huliaipole, where the Russian army is also conducting active offensive operations. Now let's examine the zone of responsibility of the East grouping. As you can see, today from the Huliaipole direction, a multitude of various geolocation data and images are coming in. Let's examine everything in detail. Let's begin perhaps with the most important news. Today, information has been received that Russian forces managed to completely clear the settlement of Zaporizhia. This is the last settlement directly before Huliaipole. Currently, the distance from the forward positions of Russian forces to Huliaipole is 1 kilometer 480 meters in a straight line. Today, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation confirms this information. Also, evidence of the clearing of Zaporizhia is a video published by the Russian side. In these frames, one can observe how the assault on the settlement proceeded overall, how Russian units first destroyed AFU positions using aerial bombs, then clearing using drones. And in the final frames of this video, one can observe several episodes of the installation of the Russian tricolor in different parts of the settlement. In total, 4 flags were recorded in this video. Here are the locations where they were installed: the southeastern sector, the central part, the northern district, and of course, the northwestern part. That is, flags were also raised on the territory of the farms. Here is this final episode, the last seconds, Russian servicemen, some farm, barracks, structure, and here a flag was installed. That is, all these materials indicate that the Russian army truly fully controls Zaporizhia, and apparently in the near future will begin an offensive directly on Huliaipole itself. And you know, today some pro-Russian analysts have already stated that in the northern and northeastern districts of Huliaipole, Russian diversionary reconnaissance groups are already actively operating. That is, returning to the map, according to separate pro-Russian experts, in this section, in this part of Huliaipole, that is, all the territory between the designated Red Line and Zaporizhia, Russian saboteurs are already actively working. The situation here is already extremely unstable for Ukrainian formations, and there is definitely no stable control by the AFU here. Already in the near future, this part of Huliaipole, located on the Russian side of the Huliaipole River, may pass under the full control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. After this, there will probably follow an attempt to ford the river and consolidate on the western bank. Also from Huliaipole, Ukrainian sources are beginning to disseminate many video materials. In these frames, one can see what remains of Huliaipole after long years of combat operations and siege. I remind you that the Russian army approached Huliaipole back in 2022 from the south. However, after the Russian army reached Huliaipole, it failed to advance further, since Huliaipole was turned into a very powerful fortified area. Now we see what already remains of it. The Ukrainian side is gradually regrouping, possibly in the near future will begin withdrawal. As you can see, despite the fact that on one hand it seems there are still many intact structures, most of the buildings have already been almost completely destroyed. Slightly to the north, data is coming in that units of the 36th Army are gradually advancing toward the settlement of Dobropilia, both from the north, from Novozlatopil, and from the east, from Solodke. Possibly, also in the near future, the map in this section will be corrected, and approximately these territories will be colored in favor of the Russian army. Along the T-85 highway, strikes with aerial bombs are regularly delivered. Russian units tightly and confidently control the main supply lines, and already in the near future, probably, this entire section will be colored in favor of the Russian Federation. Next, we move to the Pokrovsk section. Today, from this direction, a lot of important data is also coming in. The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation in its next summary reports that over the past day, the Russian army managed to completely finish clearing 2 micro-districts, Shakhove and another micro-district called Hornyak. That is, the Shakhove micro-district, there it is. Honestly, regarding Hornyak, questions remain. It's difficult, we haven't managed yet to localize this micro-district. There is a certain shopping center, Hornyak, possibly it refers to the same territory. Also from Pokrovsk, several video materials have been published. These frames were published yesterday evening, and here Russian servicemen are visible filming video from the territory of the central polyclinic of the city of Pokrovsk. From this territory, precisely at this point, a Russian serviceman raised the tricolor. That is, we see that despite the fact that most cartographers have Pokrovsk almost completely colored in favor of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, according to the latest geolocations, according to the latest reports of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, under confident control and under completed clearing are most likely approximately only these territories. Well, and also the settlement of Re, since the Ministry of Defense also stated this. Possibly this red line currently shows where the stable positions of the Russian army are located, slightly to the north, up to the railway line apparently, also under the control of Russian units, and already north of the railway, probably, a grey zone is still present, as well as separate positions, pockets of resistance by the AFU. The settlement of Mirnohrad, a small correction in the southern part, according to various cartographic resources. The armed forces of the Russian Federation over the past day managed to improve their positions. The offensive continues. Already most likely, also in the near future, the entire southern part of Mirnohrad will be colored in favor of the Russian army. On the territory of the Mirnohrad citadel, this is such a compact micro-district located between northern and southern Mirnohrad. These frames are coming in. Russian drones are flying over the terrain. We see late November already. We see that the ground is covered with frost. And we see that leaflets are being dropped, where, according to the author of this video, Ukrainian servicemen are offered to surrender. Well, it's difficult to assert whether Ukrainian units surrendered or not, but in any case, in the near future, increased intensity of combat operations should also be expected here. In the northern part of the Pokrovsk agglomeration, perhaps the most important frames are coming from the intersection of Olimpiyska Street and the T05 Fwaim Highway. These frames are being published today by Russian sources, and in these frames, one can observe a graveyard of equipment that was formed as a result not of combat operations, but as a result most likely of unsuccessful logistics by the AFU. On this territory, in this section, one can record several dozen units of destroyed Ukrainian equipment that tried to break through both toward Pokrovsk and toward Mirnohrad. However, all of it was destroyed precisely in this direction, in this section. These frames once again confirm that regardless of statements regarding control or lack of control of Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad, the presence or absence of encirclement, we see that any actions by the AFU are actually paid for at a very high price. Slightly to the north, for the second day in a row, data is coming in about the advance of Russian units on the territory of the settlement of Rodinske. The map looked this way, as of November 22nd. On November 23rd, the first correction was made based on frames received from the northeastern part. Today, another correction is being made based on frames received already from the central part. In both frames, FPV drone strikes are visible on Russian units that are gradually conducting clearing of this settlement. That is, based already on geolocation, one can assert that the Russian army controls approximately 60% of Rodinske, and Ukrainian control is gradually decreasing. There is a high probability that also in the near future, full control over Rodinske will be confirmed also by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. Slightly to the north, combat operations continue for the Shakhove salient. But apparently, these combat operations have already concluded today. Today, a number of experts, a number of cartographers stated that the Russian army over the past day managed to completely clear the Shakhove salient and the settlement of Shakhove, which had been under siege, if I'm not mistaken, since August 2025. Back in August, Russian units managed to approach this Shakhove closely, take it in semi-encirclement. And now so many months have passed, and only today, November 24th, the first sources appeared. The first information that the Shakhove salient was completely cleared and the Ukrainian army was forced to retreat. This is actually the most important advance of Russian units because precisely Shakhove was the main and most problematic point for Russian units in order to move further toward Toretsk, Sofivka, Novoshakhove, Dobropilya. But now, in connection with the fact that Shakhove is now under the control of the Russian army and Russian units have gained access to normal logistics and roads, now the offensive can resume again in the northern and northwestern directions, toward Kucherov Yar, Zoloty Kolodez. That is, toward the new Donbass defense line, which was built by Ukraine starting in 2023. Next, we move to the Kostantinovka section. A small correction based on video materials published by various sources. These frames confirm the final clearing of the settlement of Ivanopilya and the gradual exit of Russian units further west toward Berestokh and the southwestern part of Kostantinovka. On the Siversk section of the front, there are also important changes. I remind you that just the other day, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation reported on the complete clearing of the settlement of Zvanovka. This information was published by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, and video material was published where one could see a flag raised in the very northern part of this settlement. That is, some doubts remained among various sources whether the Russian army managed to completely clear truly all the central and all the western part of Zvanovka. And all these questions were resolved today. Russian sources published this video, and here one can observe how flags are already being raised and Russian units are advancing, including on the very western outskirts. Now one can assert with 100% certainty that the settlement of Zvanovka was completely cleared by the Russian army. Units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation approached closely to the Bakhmutka River, and now the question of forming the final encirclement of the settlement of Siversk is being decided. On the Lyman direction, apparently, some breakthrough of the AFU defense line is taking shape between Lyman and the settlement of Zakitny. Today, pro-Russian cartographers began actively correcting the map between these two settlements, adding more and more grey zone as well as more and more territories under the control of the Russian Federation precisely in this direction. The impression is forming that Russian units are currently moving toward the settlement of Ozern, as well as toward strongpoints located in the area of this settlement. The exit to Ozern opens access for the Russian army to the settlement of Kriva Luka, and possibly in this section, Zakitne, Kriva Luka, the Russian army also plans to ford the Siversky Donets River in order to reach the rear of the AFU grouping still located on the territory of the city of Siversk. Here, apparently in the near future, the intensity of combat operations will be very high, and probably the battles for Siversk are approaching their certain logical conclusion. On the Kupyansk direction, no changes. In the northeastern part of Kharkiv Oblast, also no changes. Russian units have taken under siege the settlement of Vovcha, against which aerial bomb strikes are currently being regularly delivered. Russian units are preparing a bridgehead before the beginning of assault operations, after which the Russian army will enter operational space and begin movement toward Bily Kolodez. And that's all, dear friends. Thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel, leave your likes, and all the best to you.